Now, as fun as it is to talk about classic Silver Age stories or supernatural themes, I want to put away the comfort food comics for this one. Some of these off the beaten path comics warrant their own essays, but I wanted to cover a bunch of different types of stories at once, so here goes. The transcript for this essay is available in the description on my website, witsendpod.com. Reporter by Dylan Williams is one of those comics that bleeds a passion for the medium. It's a series of separate but kinda interconnected stories set in the town of Willoughby in 1956. The series was published by Sparkplug Books, which was founded by Williams. Each issue follows new characters and covers different social, historical, and philosophical topics. Having each issue be accessible on its own is appreciated because I started with issue 6 and picked up issues randomly over time. Even the format of Reporter has a journalistic feel to it, where Williams lists his sources, usually with drawings and hand lettering. Williams dropped out of art school and had no real formal training. However, he had a pretty varied career, which maintained his passion for comics. He was cartooning, writing articles, starting his own publisher. He passed away in 2011 while battling cancer and left behind a diverse body of work. Issue 6 features a reporter going to a party at his publisher's house, mingling with people, discussing the mundane, debating the meaning and purpose of art. Williams fools readers with simplistic artwork and then slaps them in the face with 2 splash pages summarizing the Bhagavad Gita. It's mundanity mixed with philosophy and some occasional existential dread. Reporter is a perfect comic for people who also want to learn something and be entertained. I would say it appeals to me since it's what I've been doing with my work over the years. Hot on the trails of the underground comics movement, cartoonist Trina Robbins was exposed to the first feminist newspaper, It Ain't Me Babe, and decided to pitch them a comic produced by all women. Robert Crumb had put out his Zap Comics #1 in 1968, with Robbins's It Ain't Me Babe comic debuting in 1970, featuring an iconic cover with characters like Wonder Woman, Lulu, Olive Oil, and others. This comic would be the sample for what would become Women's Comics in 1972, the first all-women's comics anthology. A few years back, I put out a zine where I briefly talked about the Women's Comics anthology. The anthology, which ran from 1972 to 1992, covered themes like the awkwardness of growing up, social issues, soul-crushing day jobs and relationships, among other topics. Just flipping through these comics with stories by artists like Robbins, Mary Fleener, Dory Seda, and others shows the amount of variety in this anthology. Honestly, even without the historical context, these comics are pretty fucking delightful and worth a read anyway. When superhero comics leave something to be desired about human nature, Women's Comics delivers with a variety of stories and art styles without having people in spandex punching each other out. It's quite refreshing. There are sci-fi stories and parodies, so it's not just all reality-based. It's a very unfiltered presentation of every facet of life in the form of comics. I'm not being paid to recommend this comic or any of the ones in this video, but GLEEM by Freddy Carrasco needs to be required reading. What would be my quick pitch for this comic? Slice of life cyberpunk inspired by manga and Japanese cinema. Carrasco uses a manga-like style and cyberpunk imagery to tell 3 short stories of everyday people that are pretty mundane and human.
I feel like I've gotten to a point where I know who I want to draw, which is just like interesting looking young people in the future. But like now that I've got that figured out, which took forever, like I'm sort of starting to understand what I want them to say specifically.
Each story is more like a graphic novella, opening with a story of a kid tripping during what looks to be a sermon, learning the meaning of life. The second story follows a group of friends finding a replacement battery for their defunct android friend, with heavy influences of Akira Kurosawa's Ikiru, showing how far they're willing to go to save one of their own. The final story is a wordless dance sequence in a club with occasional splashes of color. Each story has its own personality and feels fleeting, leaving the reader wanting more. I won't pretend to understand the specifics of Carrasco's process, but each page is filled with life and motion and has that effect of keeping the reader's eyes glued to the paper. which is pretty valuable when some comics can be read pretty quickly and tossed into a pile. The original publisher Pow, however you say it, shut down a couple of years ago but came back recently. I believe this book has had a reprint from another publisher. Either way, it's ideal for those who want to start reading comics but don't want to go with the usual suspects. Also, go watch his Teddy Sushi animation because it's lunacy. Invader Zim fans will be familiar with this art style because Zim's creator, Jhonen Vasquez, created this comic. Johnny the Homicidal Maniac is a 7-issue series published during the mid to late 90s by a company called Slave Labor Graphics. Terrible name, but it published some good stuff. My run-in with Johnny happened during a time when mainstream comics weren't doing it for me anymore. So finding this book, forgotten by whoever owned it first, in a back issue bin was a welcomed experience. Vasquez has admitted that it was just him doing a dumb, fun, edgy story to entertain himself. It was never supposed to be a serious, venerated work. It was also his exploration of seeing just how terrible someone can be. Vasquez has talked about how the Johnny character is a representation of everything he didn't want to be, which is kind of a common theme in his work, including Zim.
Warm, fuzzy things, anything that would inspire, aww, it's not in the show. It's just not in the show, so anyone responding to that in that way, you know there's something wrong with that.
Everything I've seen of Vasquez from convention panels, he's pretty upbeat and affable, so comparing him now to a comic he did when he was 19 is kind of funny. It's one of those comics where people pretend it's deeper than it really is, or they take it too seriously. Everyone in this book is supposed to be terrible, and it's not encouraging anyone to emulate any of the behaviors or mindsets. I'm not speaking for him, but I think it's one of those books Vasquez is embarrassed by, mostly because he was put off by the fan base, which is understandable. I'm adding it because it's fascinating to see someone's early work like this where he's just puking everything out on the page, unfiltered. There was an Invader Zim comic that lasted about half a decade, but Vasquez has largely stopped producing comics. He's still out and about and working on projects, but Johnny and its spin-off Squee are absolute batshit. Let's go with something a little less morbid for the last book. In 2016, New Yorker cartoonist Navied Mahdavian and his wife Emily, who's a filmmaker, moved from San Francisco to rural Idaho to build a small home on 6 acres of land with zero experience. Quote, "It just seemed like there was this freedom and possibility that it offered. The Bay Area was prohibitively expensive. We both wanted to be artists. We could own land for very cheap there, build a tiny house, and at the time, it sounded incredibly romantic." The book uses ink wash with simple looking artwork. Not that it is simple or easy, but that Mahdavian's style makes it look that way. He's talked about how this book was a learning experience, going from single panel cartoons to doing hundreds of pages of sequential stories. I won't spoil anything, but there's a part where Mahdavian and his wife refurbish and reopen the town's defunct movie theater in an attempt to spread some culture through highbrow film, with the result being the locals suggesting a non-stop loop of John Wayne movies. The book is nuanced and compassionate, but critical of the cultural divides Mahdavian faced until his departure from Idaho in 2019. He's described the location as a character, which is appropriate, seeing as it fits the storytelling themes of a man against his natural surroundings. It features a healthy amount of information on mythology, homesteading, hunting, the history of Idaho, and Mahdavian's experiences as an Iranian American. Boy, Idaho from 2016 to 2019, huh? This country is pretty refreshing and follows 2 people wanting to live the life they want while having to confront people and a culture that is resistant to change. Introspective and a joy to read. It's nice to read something without decades of pre-established continuity or a pre-established house style. It's just someone or a set of people telling a story in a way that fits their sensibilities without needing to fit into the preconceived notions of an audience. There were some David Lapham comics that made it onto the cutting room floor for this video, but I'd recommend checking out the essay I did on Stray Bullets. Here's a quick glimpse into the future. As always, the transcript for this essay and all of my videos are on my website, witsendpod.com. Share these essays around. Thanks for watching. Chaos Ensues.